1972, Steven Stayner disappeared on his way home from school in Merced, California. He was 7 years old. 2 weeks ago, he walked into a police station in Ukiah, California with a younger child who had been kidnapped recently. Apparently, Steven had been kidnapped and told that he had been adopted. Steven had been calling his abductor Dad for some time. For 7 years, his parents, Kay and Delbert Stayner, never gave up hope that he was alive. And this morning, they have these three members of the Stayner family joined us, and they are joining us from San Francisco, where it's still the middle of the night.
The miraculous return of teenager Steven Stayner was the highlight of the notable events involving this family. This tale of two sons began in the secluded farming town of Merced, California. Unbeknownst to the Stayner family, it was always meant to end in incomprehensible tragedy. For their two sons, the age of 7 was life-defining. Whereas Steven, the younger sibling, was abducted at that age, Carrie, the older brother, was weaving dreams and fantasies of abducting and murdering women. By the end of this video, parents Delbert and Kay will have lost one beloved son twice to violence, and the other son will have been revealed as a monstrous serial killer. Theirs is a story filled with trauma, tragedy, and a descent into darkness that none of them could have ever imagined. The first of many events happened just 3 weeks before Christmas in 1972. The 4th of December, 1972 was indeed a dark day for the family of Delbert and Kay and their 5 children, Carrie, Steven, and 3 sisters. 7-year-old Steven was abducted while walking home from school. For nearly 8 years, Steven was held captive by his kidnapper, Kenneth Parnell. He endured unspeakable abuse, especially the sexual kind, from the very first night of his abduction. His abductor posed as his father during the day and was his abuser at night. His life had been brutally upended. He was separated from his loved ones and constantly drugged for the first week, priming him for the subsequent brainwash that would make him compliant. All the while, little Steven wondered why his parents didn't want him anymore, a lie his abductor told him repeatedly. And not just that, Parnell told him that he was his new adoptive dad. He changed his first name to Dennis. He also moved him away from the first hideout in Cathays Valley, just 4 miles from Steven's childhood home and parents. 1 week later, Parnell had become Dad to Steven. Over the years, the incessant abuse started to create loopholes in Parnell's story, and once Steven tried to get away, but having no idea where he was or how to get home, or even if he would be welcomed, he went back to his abductor's house. Meanwhile, back in Merced, Steven's older brother Carrie, who was the oldest of the 5 siblings, disappeared without a trace in 1972. He was only 12 years old when it happened. The 2 boys shared a bedroom throughout their upbringing. This was a hard blow for the young boy, who was known to have always looked out for his kid brother. Carrie was said to have struggled emotionally after his little brother disappeared, but rarely wanted to talk about it. It would later become known that he was jealous of the attention his little brother had gotten, and he often felt overlooked and unloved by the rest of the family. As a teenager, Carrie was described by friends and neighbors as a nice guy, a very good cartoonist, and was even voted most creative at school. Yet he was also referred to as the boy who had his brother kidnapped. These were recipes for a tough emotional childhood, especially for one who already had a hidden dark streak. He was known to compulsively pull chunks of his hair out, which made him wear hats all the time. Also, his behavior often made people uncomfortable. With a seeming compulsion to get close to women or be sexual with them, he would later admit to exposing himself to his sister's friend. In 1980, over 8 years after his abduction, and having been moved extensively from town to town, Steven, now known to many as Dennis, was a high school student said to have had a great personality. It seemed he had settled into his new reality, losing all memory of his family. But an incredible turn of events unfolded when Parnell abducted another young boy, Timothy White, because Steven, now 14 years old, was becoming too grown up and uncontrollable. This time around, Parnell enlisted the help of 14-year-old Randall Sean Poorman, offering him $50, marijuana, and alcohol in exchange for helping him lure the 5-year-old Timmy to his car. Witnessing Timmy's constant cries for his family and knowing what would happen to him if he remained with Parnell, Steven's heroic spirit was stirred. One evening, when Parnell left for work, Steven took Timmy from the remote cabin where they had been recently moved to and hitchhiked almost 40 miles in a thunderstorm to the nearest police station. On March 2, 1980, the world watched in awe as the two escaped captives were reunited with their families. Steven's miraculous survival and bravery made him an instant celebrity.
There he is, there he is.
Steven was a national hero. He returns to Merced triumphant.
Steven's return has been a joyous event.
Within days, he's on Good Morning America.
His story was splashed across newspapers and TV newscasts. Books were even written, and a TV movie was made about his ordeal.
I was 7. I know my first name is Steven.
While the community celebrated Steven's incredible feat, his older brother Kerry, now 17, remained unmoved. He downplayed his brother's heroism as something anyone with a conscience would do. Kerry admitted to feeling jealous of the attention Steven received, an early sign of his inability to forge meaningful connections. In the years following his high school graduation, Kerry drifted aimlessly, suffering what friends described as nervous breakdowns and violent outbursts. He attempted suicide in 1991 and was admitted into a mental institution in 1995 after he claimed to have suffered a nervous breakdown. He was fired from jobs for threatening rampages and found refuge in the serenity of Yosemite, where he could be alone, nude, and smoke marijuana. All the while, Steven, thrown into an alternate reality, was also facing new demons. He increasingly indulged in alcohol consumption, a habit he picked up during his days in captivity. His integration back into society was not so smooth. He never seemed to fit in well with his family. His parents still considered him their 7-year-old, and his siblings never quite reconnected with him. Constant media attention didn't help at all, and all these things were happening while he was being taunted by other students at school because of his sexual ordeal. He eventually dropped out of school and moved to another town. In 1985, he got married to Jody Edmondson, and they had 2 kids. The road to healing was long and arduous after being robbed of his childhood. His stoic character and unbreakable spirit were praised by all who watched, as the case reached its resolution and after such prolonged anguish. He later channeled his resolve into becoming a role model for victims of child abduction and abuse through advocacy. Kenneth Parnell, Steven's abductor for 7 years, was caught and sentenced to 7 years in prison, but he only served 5, a sentence that many deemed inadequate for the crimes committed. Parnell was arrested again in January 2003 while trying to buy a child. This time, he got himself a life sentence. In 2008, he died of natural causes while serving his sentence. He was 76 years old. Then more trauma struck the Stayner family in 1989. Steven tragically died in a motorcycle accident at 24. The killer fled the scene and was at large for a few days. He was identified as Antonio Loera by witnesses and later turned himself in, serving a 6-month sentence for hit and run. Devastated by his brother's passing, Carey grew even more distant from everyone. Shortly after, an uncle he was very close with was shot and killed in their shared home. Those who knew Carey worried about his deteriorating mental state. A glimmer of hope arrived in 1997 when the 35-year-old Carey secured a job as a handyman at the Cedar Lodge near Yosemite. His beloved outdoor sanctuary seemed the perfect place to find peace. But horrific urges that had long festered within him were about to be unleashed. In February 1999, Carol Sund, her teenage daughter Julie, and Julie's friend Silvina Peloso checked into the Cedar Lodge for what should have been a memorable vacation. Instead, they crossed paths with Carey Stayner, who talked his way into their room to commit a grisly triple murder. Once inside, he pulled a gun on them and asked for their car and cash. He locked the teens in the bathroom and proceeded to kill Carol Sund. Afterward, he sexually assaulted the girls and then killed them as well. Stayner was subsequently questioned and released in the triple homicide, and after 1 month, the missing women's bodies were eventually discovered. Carol and Silvina were charred in their rental car, and Julie's throat was slit. For months, Yosemite was gripped by fear as the FBI conducted its largest search ever in the park to find the killers. Incredibly, the wrong men were initially arrested, giving the real culprit, Carey Stayner, a reprieve. His reign of terror was not over. On July 21, 1999, Stayner crossed paths with Yosemite naturalist Joey Armstrong. He followed the 26-year-old woman to her cabin, where she lived alone, and savagely attacked her, decapitating her body and discarding it in a stream nearby. But it was not an easy feat. Armstrong fiercely fought for her life, making him too sloppy, leaving behind footprints and tire tracks. This time, evidence quickly pointed towards the Cedar Lodge handyman, whose vehicle was spotted near the victim's residence. Within days, Stayner was captured at a nudist colony and, under questioning, admitted to butchering both Armstrong and the 3 tourists. He shockingly demanded that a film be made about his crimes, just as one had been produced about Steven's life.
And now the Yosemite murders. Tonight, FBI investigators are asking themselves whether they could have prevented the murder of a young naturalist in the national park. The man they have arrested was questioned once before. Investigators interviewed him earlier this year in connection with 3 other murders. Back then, they released him.
At his 2002 trial, the contrasting narratives of the 2 brothers were on full display. While the courtroom heard of Steven's bravery in the face of evil, Carey's actions represented the personification of wickedness itself. He was convicted and sentenced to death, and is currently awaiting execution on San Quentin's death row.
Stayner was convicted and sentenced to death.
Carey Stayner is now 62 years old, and at San Quentin, investigators have looked at him in 5 other killings across the valley in the foothills dating back to the 80s. That includes his own uncle, but he's never been charged in those cases. His brother Steven died in a motorcycle crash in 1989.